Here recently, one question has appeared in my inbox more often than others, and it revolves around Kellen Moore, Nick Sirianni, Jalen Hurts, the offensive concept of this Eagles team, and then kind of like, why aren't they playing Jalen Hurts under center more often? Is this truly Kellen Moore's offense? Like, what can you tell us schematically? What do you see on film? Like, where do you see the divide between what is probably more so the traditional stuff that we've run underneath Nick Sirianni for the past few years, and then the kind of like the Kellen Moore influence? The first thing you would have to identify to pick up on the differences between the schemes is you have to know what is a digit-based offensive concept or scheme versus the West Coast. And there's differences that lie beyond just like the vernaculars, right? The way that they structure play sheets and play calls and the way they bring these plays forth to the quarterback, right? The whole kind of chain of command, that custodial relationship between the play caller and the quarterback and the receivers or the skill position players and, obviously the protection scheme. It goes beyond just that particular, set of circumstances. It also goes into such, things as, how often you are going to motion and move people, right? It's also going to go into essentially like the way that teams will either give or take away autonomy at the line of scrimmage to quarterbacks, okay? Which has a lot to do with the original question about being under center. It's not that a quarterback cannot have autonomy under center, all right? You could still have some autonomy, but the nature of that autonomy is going to be somewhat restricted if you're under center. There's only so much you can change the play from being under center, guys, to be quite honest, as compared to being in shotgun, all right? There's just a lot more, formationally you would have to do to change things up if you lend your quarterback that kind of control. So right from the jump, there's a really big difference between Nick Sirianni, who runs a digit-based offense, right? So digit-based offenses would be concepts and schemes such as the Earhart-Perkins scheme, the Air Coryell scheme, versus those West Coast schemes. So the Shanahan scheme is a variation of the West Coast scheme, the West Coast offense, and then the Gulf Coast, which is also a variation of the West Coast offense. Now, obviously, depending on the relationship with the quarterback, it may not be completely just a play caller in the West Coast is calling everything, but I promise you, any player who is playing inside of the digit-based scheme has way more control at the line of scrimmage than even Pat Mahomes does within Andy Reid's system. I reassure you that Joe Burrow and Pat Mahomes and Jared Goff and Brock Purdy have far less control at the line of scrimmage than guys like Josh Allen, who plays inside of a digit-based system, than guys like Jalen Hurts, who plays in a digit-based system. And we've even found out recently that Caleb Williams plays in a digit-based, system recently, which was a surprise because Shane Waldron kind of came over from the Shanahan tree, so we weren't expecting that, to be honest. So right from the jump, that's one of the biggest things to know, which is, are you looking at a digit-based concept, or are you looking at these West Coast concepts? Like, what is the concept that's being run there? What is the levity that they're giving the quarterback in terms of how much control he gets at the line of scrimmage? I want to deep dive onto this subject today because I do think that there are some legitimate things that you can look at through tape and you can pick up on a few things. And to begin with, I want to put this out there. Week upon week, we are seeing an expansion of the offense. The concepts are growing. And over the past 2 weeks in particular, I think one concept that might be getting missed a little bit, guys, is the fact that they are putting Jalen Hurts under center more frequently than they did previously, especially on rundowns. I mean, it's very obvious on rundowns that they are playing Jalen Hurts a little bit more frequently under center than they did previously. And it's been somewhat kind of in the first 2 or 3 drives of the game. You're starting to see that, which tells me that's something that they're putting inside the game plan in itself, right? It's within the install, obviously, but also they're specifically going from within that install to pull it out for game plans now. And we're starting to see them implement that against teams. Now, some of this probably has to do with the fact of, you play the Giants that can't defend the run. You're probably going to cater your game plan a little bit towards that, to be quite honest. All right. I think the first thing that has to be discussed when you're talking about conceptualizing the offensive scheme is you have to understand where each of these schemes kind of come from. And in my experience, there's really just a few schemes out there, and then everything kind of builds off of it. But I'll just be upfront with you guys. The schemes that I see most often employed throughout the NFL, and I've seen through my time, I was born in the 80s, guys, grew up with football really during the 90s primarily, and into those 2000s, into the current day. So the things that I see most often are the Air Coryell, So the Air Coryell uses a lot of ace formations, and it's just a vertical stretch offense. Some of the names that you'll hear here are, it really starts with Sid Gilman. Sid Gilman being one of those like big figures in terms of the NFL and the expansion of offensive concepts, but it's really his disciples, two guys in particular. Don Coryell, who the offense is named after, but also Joe Gibbs, who was with them with San Diego for a while, with the Chargers for a while. So you have those old school teams like with Dan Fouts, and you have those old school teams with, Joe Gibbs and Theismann and those guys down there in Washington. You have those old school teams like Mike Martz. The Greatest Show on Turf was a variation of the Air Coryell offense. It's a variation of it, but it still was very much an Air Coryell style offense. Past that, you go back to the old Norv Turner and what's the other gentleman's name, guys? Zampese, the old Dallas Cowboys, Jimmy Johnson kind of offensive concepts they had there, right? Underneath there, Norv Turner and Zampese as the offensive coordinators there. Aikman and Irving and Emmett. That was all really, honestly, building the Air Coryell system. Jason Garrett kind of brought that with him with Dallas. He installed that with Tony Romo and those guys for a while. So, I mean, the Air Coryell is definitely one of the concepts that, to this day, that vertical stretch concept is still run quite frequently across the NFL. Another concept that you see quite often across the NFL, and it's been popularized really beginning in the 80s, but accelerated itself through the 90s as it left San Francisco, is the West Coast offense. And to be fair about this, if you were to sit down and really study the West Coast offense, you would find out it really didn't originate in San Francisco. It got brought there and it got popularized there because the Super Bowl victories, of course. But it really started in Cincinnati due to injury, right? So in Cincinnati, they kind of roll out this idea of the West Coast offense. Bill Walsh does. And that's where you get guys like Bill Walsh with Joe Montana and Jerry Rice and John Taylor and Roger Craig and all those guys, right? And then you get guys such as George Seifert, who followed him, Mike Holmgren, who brought, took it from being under center into shotgun formation once he got to Green Bay and started coaching Brett Favre, Andy Reid. There's a lot of these guys. I mean, Marty Morningwig, Zach Taylor, Matt Nagy, Adam Gase, Joe Philbin. Dougie P would be partially as part of that West Coast kind of grouping of people. You got guys like John Gruden. John Gruden is a West Coast guy. So the West Coast offense being unique in the fact that you are going to supplement your run game to an extent by using the running backs within the passing game or wide receivers, which then puts a focus on yak, yards after the catch, or, yards accumulated after the reception, essentially. And then you also have this idea of the footwork and the timing of offense. This is where you will see, especially when you're working with under center, when you're under center guys, your footwork matters quite a bit when you're getting into those 5 and 7 step drops from being under center. Basically, that receiver's route concept, when they reach the top of the route stem, it has got to align with when the quarterback is hitting their hitch, or else you got a problem. It was said that basically back in the day, Bill Walsh could tell you essentially where to put the ball based upon the coverage and based upon the footwork. He could tell you exactly where the ball would be based upon those two facts. So the West Coast offense, okay? Pretty much every team to some extent runs some form of the West Coast offense at this point. One of the bigger ones that I don't think is discussed nearly as often, because I think it's the hardest to define, because it's based upon principles and not necessarily actionable film things. It's these principles and these guidelines, but it's not like as easy to define as like the West Coast offense. It's nowhere near as easily defined as like the Air Coryell offense. And it's almost exact opposite in some ways of the West Coast offense. When you're working with the West Coast offense, the coach has a lot of control over that offense, to be quite honest, over the quarterback. However, when you get to the Earhart-Perkins offense, which is uniquely a New England-based offense, came out of New England in the 1970s and kind of really stuck around through the 90s. Pete Carroll being really the only breakaway from that system for a very short duration of time for the Patriots. This is a quarterback-centric offense. And I know that normally when you hear the Earhart-Perkins concept discussed, you're really thinking power run game, smash mouth football. And that is an element of it, right? And you will find early elements of that, such as Charlie Weiss with Tom Brady with New England, right? Marty Ball. So you got to go to, Marty Schottenheimer and the Chiefs, Christian Okoye, the Nigerian Nightmare in that Chiefs offense back in the day, which also featured Joe Montana for a little while, ironically. Dave Wannstedt, in the NFL and at the college ranks, what he did with the University of Pittsburgh. You got guys like other New England coaches that still are within that tree. Josh McDaniels, who took it away from more of the smash mouth approach and introduced the concept of really using a slot receiver and an expansion of 11-man personnel within that concept and that scheme of the Earhart Perkins, right? Then you go to Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien with Bill Belichick and that New England offense took it, Charlie Weiss, pony sets, 2 running back sets, I formation, offset, split back or pro set. You go to the 11-man expansion with Josh McDaniels to the formation and the utilization of 12-man personnel when you get to Bill O'Brien and what he did in this one. This offensive concept is absolutely part of Nick Sirianni's identity, guys. And it's, you'll have a lot of different coaches here. Todd Haley is a big guy in terms of this scheme and the system of things, the way that they're used here. Outside of Todd Haley, you got guys like that have flirted around with it. Like Bruce Arians has flirted around with it a little bit. And then you get guys, Bruce Arians is not specific to the Earhart Perkins. He's a little bit more towards that Eric Coryell style, but he meshed those two together a little bit. Tom Moore, old Indianapolis Colts, Peyton Manning and those guys, Peyton Manning and Reggie Wayne and Marvin Harrison and those guys. That was a meshing of the Earhart Perkins concept with the Eric Coryell concept together in that system and that scheme. And some of the things that you'll notice about the system and scheme that are the things that ring true and let you know that you're dealing with, a system and a scheme that's, similar to what the Eagles are running here. And it's definitely a main component of what we do. It's a quarterback-centric offense, so the quarterback has control at the line of scrimmage. And then, obviously guys like Tom Brady and guys like Peyton Manning and those dudes, those guys also set protections. They did everything, things that we're expecting Jalen Hurts to now do. His role keeps expanding within that, right? These are the guys where you do hear a lot of checks at the line of scrimmage. You'll hear the kill, right? Because they'll set up, they'll look at the defense, they'll look at the coverage, they'll look at the way that they've aligned themselves, and they may kill for one side of the field to go to the other side of the field, right? So you might get tango, kill, and you might get whiskey. You'll get stuff like that, guys, where they're changing the side of the field on you. It's very pro-friendly in terms of the quarterback. The quarterback you have to have a bona fide stud there at quarterback. That's been the thing that a lot of people will criticize the system for, is that if you don't have that bona fide stud at the quarterback position, it's really hard to operate that offense. And you can see this offensive concept expanding beyond the Tom Brady's, beyond the Peyton Mannings, the Eli Mannings of the world. Phil Simms in the Giants ran this. Joe Theismann and those guys were a little bit more into the Eric Coryell side of things, but there were probably some times where you could see them lean into the concept of Earhart Perkins as well. Frank Reich was a guy who kind of brought this on. Marv Levy, those type of coaches, right? Jim Kelly being able to kind of play between the Eric Coryell style of offense and then also being able to use the Earhart Perkins side of things. These are guys that had control of the line of scrimmage, right? And you'll hear a lot of things like, think back to Nick Sirianni's comments about alignment-less wide receivers. This whole concept that he brought forth about having wide receivers who he doesn't want to define as being X, a Y, or a Z. He wants them to be able to have versatility there, right? Why is that? Because you're going to run very few plays, right? It's not like a really expansive playbook per se, but what it is it's a lot of window dressing with these concepts, right? So what you'll get here is you'll get concepts to where you might have a 2x2 stack that could be your base, the static offense you set, the baseline of what you do, right? But it might be run sometimes at 11 personnel, it might be run sometimes at 12 personnel, and then you might change the alignment of each player, right? You might have tight ends to one side of the formation, receivers to one side of the formation. You might have Goddard and AJ to one side of the formation with Devontae and Jack Stoll or Grant Calcaterra, whatever, to another side of the formation, right? Then you might just kind of keep switching them around like that, guys. You might bring your tight ends in line and then have your receivers off the line of scrimmage and back, right? But on opposite sides of each other. It's those subtle things, guys. That's the Earhart Perkins. It's absolutely a staple of what they do here in Philadelphia, guys. I would call it the basis of what they do here. It is the Earhart Perkins system here with Nick Sirianni. Brian Dable is another guy who uses this, by the way. Now, mind you, it's not a singular system. The way Peyton Manning would combine parts of the Eric Coryell system with the Earhart Perkins, when you get this system, I mean, the way that these things have grown in terms of the actual install of your offense and the way that you put together like your game plans and your playbooks. Now, I mean, you're looking at, Earhart Perkins being like, the overall guiding philosophy of quarterback control at the line of scrimmage, receivers being able to option their routes, That's a big part of this is receiver and quarterback communication and then being on the same page with what they're seeing defensively, being able to mesh and match your personnel. So that way you have this kind of alignmentless personnel. And then, you have this very finite group of plays, but at the same time of saying that, guys, like, they window dress the crap out of them. So it's not easy to pick up on what they're doing. And they'll also change the alignment so the roles can change for the player, although the route design is the same. The person running this now looks different, so the defense doesn't pick up on it as easily. When we talk about Nick Sirianni, his is Earhart Perkins mixed in with a little bit of the West Coast. You're going to get some West Coast stuff, those bubble screens. They'll try to work in. They're getting a little better with working in passes to the running back, like screen passes, trying to, basically horizontally stretch the defense. Definitely Kellen Moore's influence. Kellen Moore's influence is definitely grounded more on the West Coast and spread together. He's more of the Andy Reid style, the West Coast to spread. Mike Kafka is with the Giants, So, yes, it's Earhart Perkins. It's very small part of the West Coast offense, what they want to bring here. And I think that's part of what's expanding in this offense is those quick read progressions where you got to have proper ball placement. You want to try to get guys in motion and moving. You want to hit them in stride, all those things. And then you also will see spread concepts here, okay? Your spread concepts being just like, normally speaking, you're trying to literally spread the offense out, but also you're looking at playing a little bit more 11-man personnel, 10-man personnel, 1-man personnel, right? You're trying to get faster, quicker, kind of agile guys on the, out there on the field. And then also you build in those parameters of what we saw from the RPO and RPR-based offenses from college. You combine all that stuff together, guys, and you get the basis of what is the Philadelphia Eagles offense. Now, I want to go back to that Indianapolis example. And I want to talk for a second about that and then put it into how you work this thing together, okay? In the Indianapolis example, we're talking about Tom Moore. We're talking about Howard Mudd. We're talking about Peyton Manning, okay? In their prime, this is what they had put together on that offense, guys. Peyton Manning, Reggie Wayne, Marvin Harrison, Edgerrin James, and Joseph Adai later on. And then they had tight ends like Dallas Clark. They had tight ends. They had a few different tight ends. They had I can't remember the guy's name anymore, but they did have someone that followed Dallas Clark, but I can't remember his name off the top of my head anymore. Ulrich, something like that, guys. I can't remember his exact name. But go back to that 2006. They won the Super Bowl with Joseph Adai and all them. But go back to that 2004 Colts offense. I think it was one of the most underrated offensive units in NFL history that just doesn't get the same kind of noise that you get from the greatest show on turf with, the Rams, okay? The way that the mid-90s Cowboys offense got a lot of noise around them, right? The way that's, that 2007 Tom Brady, Randy Moss offense, the 2011, 12 personnel, Gronk and Aaron Hernandez offense got, right? Go back to the 2004 Colts offense, guys, right? You had a 1,548-yard rusher in Edgerrin James, and you also had 483 yards receiving. You had a 2,000 all-purpose back in Edgerrin James in that offense, okay? You had a 1,210-yard reception guy in Reggie Wayne. You had a 1,113-yard reception guy in Marvin Harrison, followed up by a 1,077-yard reception guy in Brandon Stockley. And then you also had Dallas Clark, who had over 400 yards receiving. That's how lethal that offense was in 2004, running these concepts. You can clearly point to the cornerstones. What are the cornerstones of their offense? Just like in Philly, when all is healthy, it's easy to point to the cornerstones of the offense, right? It's very easy to go. It's A.J. Brown, it's Devontae Smith, it's Dallas Goedert, it's Saquon Barkley. That is the cornerstones. That is the Earhart Perkins system mixed in with the other elements, right? Is there a little Air Coryell to what we do, some vertical stretch? Come on, man. Absolutely. That's not hard to point out. You guys don't need me to point that out. You can point that out all day on film without me, right? Are there some elements of the West Coast offense there? Yes, I think that's the portion of the playbook that's expanding a little bit more, right? It's not that Nick Sirianni is unfamiliar with it, but if you really think about Nick Sirianni and his influences, yes, he has Mike McCoy, who was a West Coast guy, but he also worked a little bit with the Earhart Perkins side of things too. Mostly West Coast, though. Mike McCoy was. But go back to the Chiefs, right? When he's with the Chiefs, what are they working there? They're working with Todd Haley. What is Todd Haley? Todd Haley's an Earhart Perkins guy. That's the influence here, right? You get to Kellen Moore, like what's some of the other things Kellen Moore is bringing? You guys remember the old Jerry Glanville 1990s, 1980s Atlanta Falcons? Do you remember that offense, the run and shoot? What's the run and shoot, guys? Come on, I know the young guys might not know this, but I know you older guys remember that June Jones and Kevin Gilbridge offense. I know you guys remember, what was that guy's name? They had another one, Moose Davis. Couldn't think of his name for the longest time. I was like, wait a minute. I always think about Daryl Johnson when they say the Moose, so like it messes me up a little bit. But, you go back to that motion-based, right? It was highly relying on motion, moving and moving your wide receivers around, right? 10 personnel, high utilization of 10 personnel and 11 personnel. So very much kind of similar in some regards to like air raid and spread concepts to an extent, right? It was built pretty much off of like the old school flexbone offense, kind of similar in concept to it, but it's an expansion upon that. You would see a lot of athletic quarterbacks that would be used as like kind of runners inside of this system. And then you would get these unbalanced lines where they would force teams into like nickel and dime situations, right? So what they would do to you is they would come out there with, 10 personnel, 11 personnel, spread you out, start hitting you with motion and stuff and doing all these things. And then they come all of a sudden, they switch over the line and they get you unbalanced on the line to where they're heavy to one side of the offensive line on you. And they set you up with an athletic quarterback to take advantage of you. Like the old school run and shoot stuff is definitely a part of what I see from Kellen Moore mixed in with that West Coast offense, mixed in with some basic spread concepts. You have to bring it together, right? The way that Tom Moore had to work with Howard Mudd and Peyton Manning to build like the concepts of the Air Coryell and mix that together with the Earhart Perkins side of things. You have to mix this together, right? I don't think Nick Sirianni is as directly involved as people think, but I do think he has an indirect influence here. I don't think he has to be as directly involved because he's got guys inside the building who already like this system, who've already been inside of similar systems and they like where it's at, right? They have guys, down there such as Jeff Stoutland to advocate for him. He has guys such as the passing game coordinator for this offense and Kevin Patullo to advocate for him. So really and honestly, when you look at this offense, it's a combination of you got to have a guy like Kellen Moore working with a guy like essentially Jeff Stoutland and Kevin Patullo and Jalen Hurts to form the basis of this offense. And what I see currently is an expansion into the run game from under center and out of pistol. I see a lot of pistol and I see a lot of under center runs kind of creeping their heads up the last 2 weeks in particular, including the big run into the end zone where they had to move big Dexter Lawrence out of the way, who really did a good job in that game. I mean, they had to start running outside. They had to start running off tackle because of how good Dexter Lawrence is and how much he was just compounding it, right? The system everybody wants is the Shanahan, McVay, Kubiak system, which is just it's a variation of the West Coast offense, guys, where the West Coast offense uses their running backs and their wide receivers to basically get to the outside, get to the flats, get to the, outside the numbers in the low zone area or the low area against man to beat you. They pretty much use the wide zone run concept to do that. It's very similar, just kind of like almost invert it in the way that they do it, right? Obviously, they still use the running backs quite heavily in the pass game when you look at those coaches. Sean McVay and the way that they use Kyron Williams, Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, whatever his name is, when he gets back healthy as well. They have their cornerstones of what their offensive concept is, right? Shanahan, he's got his where he's got, Deebo Samuel and he's got, when they're healthy, Ayuk and Kittle and CMC, right? Those offenses, like I can almost tell you right away who's under center just by who the offense is, right? If you tell me the offense, and I can tell you the guys that are all off of these trees. Bobby Slowick, he's Houston's passing game coordinator. Used to be the passing game coordinator, for the 49ers. Offensive coordinator now for Houston, right? 37-year-old. Zach Robinson from Atlanta. Used to be the passing game coordinator for the Rams. Came underneath McVay. He's a 38-year-old out there in Atlanta. Clint Kubiak, obviously Gary Kubiak's son. Right now, he's with New Orleans. Wes Phillips used to be the passing game coordinator and the tight end coach for the Rams not too long ago. Wes Phillips, is now kind of taking control of the offense out there. You take a look at Matt LaFleur. Matt LaFleur came off the Shanahan tree. There's a lot of these guys that came off of the Shanahan tree. Luke Getsy. Luke Getsy is a Shanahan guy, technically. And even if you go out into Shane Waldron and what they're doing out in what they were doing in Seattle and what they thought they were going to do in Chicago, which has been a curveball, guys. They thought Shane Waldron, who was a Shanahan tree guy, would be doing that, but actually he's kind of resorting into the Nick Sirianni offense. They're kind of resorting into that, Earhart-Perkins offense out there in Chicago. So that was a little bit of a surprise for them because they definitely, not probably what everyone thought fan base-wise when they hired him there. Of course, he proposed and made his pitch, and they're doing what they feel is the best. And that's the great thing about the Earhart-Perkins is it works off your personnel, right? It's not static in the sense of like you're bound to have strengths on one, like one position group over another, right? Like you just take wherever your team is the strongest at and you build around those concepts. That's the beauty of that system. When we talk about under center offenses, I do think it's important to point out. I know there was an article written recently by Bleeding Green Nation during the offseason where they were saying that like Kellen Moore was 27th in shotgun formation utilization. But I warn you about that stuff, guys. The problem with that is the phrasing of the way they said that. It doesn't really tell you anything about how often they're playing under center. That could be for various reasons, right? The thought process here is that they're going to play a lot more under center with play action passing. That's not necessarily true. More than we've done in the past, absolutely. He did a lot of that stuff with Dak Prescott. But even in Dallas, they were pulling back on that concept a little bit. They kept pulling back on it, pulling back on it. And when he got to the Chargers, essentially they took a guy who had been top 5 for a couple of years in a row, right, with Joe Lombardi, with Shane Steichen, with Justin Herbert. He was an under center quarterback. But then when Kellen Moore got him, he wasn't really under center that much anymore, guys, to be quite honest about the situation. Even to this current season, I believe he ranks, 31st with 27 under center snaps, one ahead of Jalen Hurts, 25 on this 2024 season so far. And you look back on what he did on 2023, guys, I think it was whether they were running the ball or passing the ball, I want to say it was in the 70s. It was like high 70s, 78 or so. 78 total snaps. I think they only had like 50-some snaps from a passing formation. I do expect to see an uptick, guys. I think there's going to be an uptick just because, like, while Jalen Hurts did have under center snaps into the 50s, 60s, and 70s when you counted in the run game underneath Shane Steichen and underneath, Nick Sirianni, he was always under like 20 passes, guys. He never really had more than 20 passes on a season. And he's already at like 25 already in this current, year. And we're only, 6 games in, guys, 6 games in at this point. So, I mean, you can see there's an expansion happening. Is it going to meet the expectation that we're expecting in terms of like how much of the expansion occurs in terms of being under center, using play action and all that stuff? I don't know, man. I mean, a lot of this has to do with the comfort of the quarterback and then also like the working relationship between Jeff Stoutland and Kellen Moore and Kevin Patullo and those guys coming together with Jalen Hurts. Part of the comfort thing, that's Nussmeier's. That's Nussmeier's role. Nussmeier's got to get him comfortable. Okay? That's what Nussmeier does. And by the way, each and every one of these systems, you've had guys under center. Tom Brady, early in his career, he was in this similar system. It's the basic guidelines, same system. Just, utilized differently depending upon the plays they ran. They ran a lot of tempo, so they stopped using a lot of motion in New England because they were running tempo. So they would go empty back set and hit you with tempo in New England for a while with Brady, especially towards the later years there. So that kind of stopped them from being able to use a lot of motion and stuff inside their offense there. And it also became a little bit more of a spread. It was kind of combining this Earhart-Perkins offense with spread concepts. You look at Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning was not a big fan of being under center. There's some pretty unique evaluations that occurred about Bruce Arians coming in and bringing a variation of the essentially Earhart-Perkins along with the Air Coryell concepts. There were some really interesting comments that were made in an interview there. I think they were interviewing, I think this was Hasselbeck. Just listen to what he says in this interview, guys. I'm going to read it word from word. This is coming from the Colts.com's forums. It's the most complicated offense in the NFL is the name of the actual article on the Colts.com. Okay? Contrast that with Peyton Manning and Howard Mudd's offense. They mean Tom Moore, but we get what they mean there. That was always one of the best in the league. It's been said that the Colts ran only a handful of different run plays. The two starting receivers almost always lined up on the same side of the field. There was hardly any motion. The starting tight ends almost never left the field. They ran no huddle most of the time, tempo. and the play calls were simply enough that they could be communicated with code words and hand signals. I think to, I hate to say this, guys, but think to Chip Kelly's offense there in terms of the hand signals and stuff. And for a decade, that offense was always one of the best and most efficient in the league, setting records along the way. It relied on supreme execution, accurate throws, good route running, etc. Not without its flaws at times, but always enviable. The Colts offense had plenty of issues with slow starts. Let me read that part again. The Colts offense had plenty of issues with slow starts. And in a lot of those games, the offense was able to get clicking when they scraped the huddle, let the quarterback make the calls at the line, and started attacking the field. The Great Green Bay game in 2012, Arians made a conscientious decision to go no huddle and let the players set the pace. So think about that offense, guys. Think about some of the things you just heard said here. Does it sound like any other offense you know that's been run here for the past few years? So you're asking me, are there still offensive concepts that are Nick Sirianni's? Of course. I don't think Nick Sirianni is as direct in the influence of it as it is an indirect influence. Like, he's got guys to advocate for it, right? Jalen Hurts knows what he likes about Nick Sirianni's offense. It doesn't require Nick Sirianni to be directly involved in that specific instance. Now, does Nick Sirianni have a role when it comes to the game plans and stuff? Of course. Did he have a role when it came to the install? Of course. Nick's got to sign off on the install of this offense. Nick had to sign. He's got to sign off on each and individual game plan. He is ultimately the guy that's responsible. But I do think this is more of an indirect result of things, guys. I don't think it's as directly him being meddlesome as people think, to be quite honest. But we still see elements of his offense. There's no doubt about that. But I do think as each week goes by, you'll see more of those 3x1 stack sets, guys. You'll see more 3x1 sets, period. So 3x1 stack, guys, means you're trying to create some free releases and do some things, right? 3x1 just means you're putting three receivers to one side of the field versus one side. I told you guys in a previous video that I consider the basis of the Eagles offense to be a 2x2 stack, okay? To where essentially it can be inline sometimes, where they run an inline tight end and a wing, and then they got two receivers on the same side of the field together, right? It can be a balanced line where you have one tight end stacked, another tight end stacked, and then receivers on opposite side of the fields on each other that are off the line of scrimmage, yard and a half or so back, right? Or it can simply be where you got receiver, tight end, and it's spread out, or they're closer, whether you want it spread or you want it tight to formation, right? So 2x2 stack, essentially, guys. And then from there, you run your offensive concepts, and you can mix and match and move your receivers the way you want them, okay? Sometimes you'll see that they have the quarterback can be potentially under center in those looks. Sometimes the quarterback can be, set up in a way to where he's in the shotgun under those looks. Sometimes the running back is offset to the right in those looks. Sometimes the running back is actually going to be in the pistol in those looks. But I do think that's the basis. And then from there, they build from the offense. I think as the season goes on, guys, we will see some of Nick Sirianni's offensive concepts will get pulled back a little bit, and you're going to see Kellen Moore's concepts kind of grow a little bit more. I think if you can get 2 years in this concept together, this offense together, I think this thing would look unique. I don't know what the final results would be. You're mashing a lot of concepts, guys, all right? I mean, you're taking Kellen Moore, which is using some spread concepts. He's using a lot of, West Coast with the spread, the Andy Reid stuff. He's very similar into using those concepts and those things, right? But then he's mixing in with some of the things we saw kind of Jerry Glanville and, June Jones and Kevin Gilbride and all those guys bring together, where they created their offensive concepts with the run and shoot, where they used a lot of motion and all those things, right? So we're seeing that kind of incorporated into this offense. We're seeing that meshing of these concepts together, right? Along with Nick Sirianni's version of the RPO, RPR, kind of offense that has to do with the spread concepts mixed in with that, kind of vertical stretch Air Coryell mixed in with that, kind of Earhart Perkins, where the quarterback has, central command over the offense. Where I think this thing is going, and to be honest about this is just an educated guess, guys, because I am not in the meeting rooms, so I'm not privy to this information. I'm just judging what I'm seeing on tape and the expansion I'm seeing in these little microdoses on the tape. I think that they want to come out in that West Coast coordinator coach-controlled system early in games where they put Jalen under center sometimes, and that's another trick to the under center thing, guys, is that it's not that you can't have, control at the line of scrimmage under center, but there's only so much you can shake and you can change it underneath center, guys, to be quite honest. Like, it does devolve some of the power away from the quarterback if we're being honest about that. However, I do think they want to start off with that West Coast kind of inspired spread concept with a little under center work early on in the first few possessions of games. And then also I do think that, depending on how Saquon works in space, they may resort to that too with bigger leads. They might go under center a little bit more often than we're used to seeing just because, they're trying to basically run a 4-minute offense at that point. And it's just about where they think where they're most advantageous at. I do think that you'll see that side of the offense. And then I think if Jalen's feeling it, if they get into the Kellen Moore flow of the offense and Jalen's feeling it, and like he's starting to liven up and he's nice and loose and relaxed in that game, then you might see them go into more of the Nick stuff, right? You might see them go into what's really and honestly called, it's the digit-based offense stuff, right? What they call digit or numbers-based offenses, okay? Where the quarterback has a lot more control over the offense, right? To where they might let him go no huddle, kind of hurry up style offensive play, right? This idea of tempoing things. So where if Jalen is really feeling it, they may start tempoing. And I wouldn't even be shocked if we keep struggling in the first quarter if we don't revert that to Jalen a little bit, right? If we don't go into tempo instead of kind of falling into the way we're doing the offense right now just because we're not quite there yet. That's a possibility. But I think ultimately they want to start off with that Kellen controlled into the tempo stuff. They want to gain those big leads. And then by the time they hit the third quarter, they want to be pretty much running out a 4-minute offense for a quarter to a quarter and a half worth of football, guys. They want to be playing absolute takeaway, control ball, that style of offense. That's kind of how they're built to be. I don't know if they'll be successful doing it, but I definitely think that, that's the direction they want to take things. Only time will tell if, they can mix and match this together. And the last thought I'll leave you about this is that now you see the challenge Brian Johnson had last season because they started wanting to do this last year with Brian Johnson. Now they have Kellen Moore in. And what is the calling core to Kellen Moore again, right? Once again, Brian Johnson had experience working with Dak Prescott, right? And then working with Jalen Hurts. Well, Kellen Moore doesn't necessarily have experience dealing with Jalen Hurts, but he has worked with Dak Prescott before, and he's emerged these systems before. He has emerged this before with the Jason Garrett's of the world, okay? Jason Garrett is definitely a digit-based coach, okay? He has some West Coast staples he can run to. Every offense is a mixture of stuff, but he's definitely a little bit more in that digit-based stuff, to be quite honest, guys. And then he had to take that and merge that when Mike McCarthy came in with the West Coast offense. He's merging these concepts that Dak is familiar with, that's digit-based, that's really towards more so the Eric Coryell side of things. And he had to merge that with the West Coast stuff that essentially Mike McCarthy has, where they were reverting some of the control of the line of scrimmage, not all of it, but some of the control of the line of scrimmage to Dak, which is kind of some of the basis of what they call the Gulf Coast, right? It's a variation of the West Coast. They call it the Gulf Coast, but in the West Coast, the quarterback has very little control over the offense. It's definitely your play caller. And then in the Gulf Coast systems, there's a little bit more of a back and forth, a little bit of a relationship between play caller, coordinator, and quarterback. It's one of those situations. That's why I think Kellen Moore was so attractive to bring here to revitalize this thing. Is once again, they're kind of looking at a coach who's had success with Dak Prescott, who's in division, you know what I mean? And they want to bring that here to Jalen Hurts and this style of offense and make it their own individual thing. I definitely think that's part of it, guys. All right, y'all, if you enjoyed today's topic, and this was a long one, I appreciate if you guys held around this long. Look, YouTube's telling me that you would enjoy this content right here. And if you are not a member of the Cerebral Football community and you'd like to join the Cerebral Football community, I would love to add you. Click right here, guys, and join. All right, y'all. Peace. I'm out of here.